When advising Santa Clara students, the most common questions that we get about OPT have to do with timing. When should I file my application? When should I request to begin my employment? When can I start working? When do I have to start working? These are really the most common questions. And of course, these are the questions that have the most personal considerations for each individual student. There is no one right answer. What works for one student might not be the best thing for another student. So we're going to give you some general information to help you make decisions about specifically your program end date and how that will relate to the start date of your employment that you're going to request when submitting your OPT I-20 request form to our office to get the OPT I-20 that you need to file your application with the government. Everything is going to be based around your program end date. Your program end date is almost certainly going to be the last day of finals during your last academic term. So if you are graduating in the spring, your last day of finals could be in June. Usually it might be the second week in June. For 2022, the program end date will be June 10th. If your program end date is June 10th, you are allowed to file your application 90 days before that program end date, right? So you can start mailing your application in the beginning of March or submitting your application in the beginning of March. You can also submit your application up to 60 days after your program end date. So if you're completing your degree in June, you actually have until August to submit your OPT application. We typically recommend that students submit their applications as early as possible for two reasons. The first one is you get it out of the way and it doesn't get in the way of any of your last minute graduation celebrations and preparations. The other reason is if for some reason something goes wrong, filing early will allow you the opportunity to potentially refile. It's very rare that something goes wrong, but it's just a way to protect yourself just in case. Also, of course, the earlier you file, the sooner that you get your EAD card, the sooner that you can likely begin work. However, if you're not sure that you're going to complete your degree, if you're waiting for a grade to know whether you graduate, you're waiting for a grade to pull up a GPA, you may want to wait until after your program end date to apply for OPT, and that's okay too. In addition to the program end date determining the earliest possible day of filing and the latest possible day of filing, your program end date also determines the start date that you can ask for. When you are submitting your OPT I-20 request to our office, and when we submit the OPT recommendation into the SCU immigration system, we put a preferred start date. That start date is based on what you put on your OPT I-20 request, and it can be any day as early as the day after your program end date. So if your program end date is June 10th, the last day of finals, you could ask for your OPT EAD card to begin on June 11th, but you don't have to ask for that. You could ask for an OPT EAD start date that is up to 60 days after your program end date. So again, if your program end date is in June, you could ask for an OPT start date in August. The benefit of asking for a later program EAD start date is it gives you time to relax after you complete your degree, time to find a job if you don't already have one lined up, time to travel if you want to visit your family before starting your OPT employment. And so we do find that most students do ask for a later start date. The only reason to ask for a start date that's immediately after your program end date would be if you already have a job lined up and you need to start working with them as soon as possible. Otherwise, we would recommend taking a little bit of time off to celebrate the accomplishment of completing your degree, perhaps visiting family or traveling in the US, and giving yourself time to find employment because not everyone has employment lined up when they apply for OPT before graduation. It is really important to remember that you are not allowed to start working until you have your EAD card in hand and the EAD card is valid. This is really important as you're talking to your employer if you have a job lined up, because again, the application sits with the government for a while before it's approved. We've seen EAD cards be approved very quickly, potentially within a month, but we've also seen applications take 4 or 5 months to be approved during the peak application period of the summer and the end of the spring quarter. And so it is important to remember, based on when you filed your application, when you're likely to have the actual card in your hand. Additionally, just because you file the application early and ask for the earlier start date doesn't mean that you can start working. You do have to have that card. So it's really important to balance your start date with your filing period in order to optimize when your card could arrive. There's no guarantees, but you do the best that you can. Another thing to note is that if you ask for a start date and your card is not yet approved by that start date, the government will manually move your start date. So an example would be if you ask for June 11th to be your start date and your application is approved by June 11th, then they'll give you June 11th as your start date. But if you ask for June 11th to be your start date and they don't approve your application until, let's say, July 1st, they will not backdate your EAD card start date. Instead, they will move the start date to July 1st, and similarly, they will move your end date as well. Typically, the end date for OPT will be 364 days after your start date. So if your start date is July 1st, then your end date would be June 30th of the following year, right? The final point about OPT timing is that while your OPT EAD card is valid, starting on the day that it's valid, you are eligible for a total of 90 days of unemployment. This is an aggregate. So if it takes you 10 days from the start of your card validity to find a job, you've used 10 days of your unemployment and have 80 days left. Additionally, if you have no job by the time your card begins validity, you can stay in the US looking for employment related to your major for 90 days. For this reason, it's possible to take up to 5 months after graduation to find employment related to your major, because you can ask for an EAD that's valid 60 days after your program end date, and then you still have 90 days from when the card becomes valid to find your employment. I hope that this video was helpful to you. If you have questions, please contact our office. We're happy to discuss this further.